Yeah, I think the greatest thing about it is like there's been a lot of complacency that has been in practice for our industry in terms of like this is how we build a building, this is what we do, and now we're met with new challenges, and we're actually getting to kind of stretch our creativity a little bit more.
Regardless of your market and your code compliance pathway, all buildings benefit from a whole building approach to design. The things that impact performance, we know are your enclosure in combination with your mechanical systems.
So we got the RDH folks on the podcast today, and we're going to really obviously focus on envelope performance, but though you guys operate throughout the country, throughout the continent rather, it seems like RDH is primarily focused or built around markets that prioritize performance, call it. I don't want to say more sophisticated markets, but if I really think where RDH has a big presence, you go up to Vancouver and Seattle and Boston. So really in these cities that call it are more progressive or forward thinking or innovative versus some of the other markets we have in this country. So would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the Northwest has always been relatively innovative in their approach to enclosure. What RDH's influences on that, I think we'd like to think it was great. But yeah, it's we started in Vancouver in '97 during the leaky condo crisis, and then kind of grew south of the border, and then about 6 years ago came east. 7 years ago came east. So it's yeah, I would agree with that statement to a certain, and I hope that we have an influence on it, but it's really, as you know, Boston is a large market, so we're only, you only have so much pull as an enclosure firm.
Well, so obviously in a performance-based market that's either driven by local codes, which obviously it's not like the International Building Code applies as much here. It's probably local codes or stretch codes that are taking precedent. Would you say in a market like that, a facade consultant is even more prominent or prevalent in terms of their impact on the job? And on the contrary, or flip to that, let's say when you're selling your service or talking to an owner, you go to other cities or markets, and it's not like they don't have weather. So why, I don't know, why is it that in some of these markets, you go to Boston, it's so prominent, it would just be assumed you would have a facade consultant on every job. And, I'm in New York where a lot of it was driven by special inspections. So the special inspection requirements just to get sign off on the project. So it was an inevitability. You have to have a special inspection agency on the job, and then call it, for an uninformed owner, let's just tack on the consulting aspect if we even need it. But you cross the water and you go to New Jersey, and all of a sudden the requirements are totally different. And you see high-rise buildings that might not even have an envelope specialist. Meanwhile, still exposed to the same weather, still exposed to the same wind loads, and the systems are still under call it the same pressures. So do you really think sort of the prevalence of the facade consultant is driven by the market, driven by the codes, or is it just kind of business as usual, what the market does?
I think, I'll let Andrew chime in on part of this as well, because he's definitely operated in the market longer than I have. But I think that, before the code change that currently happened, I think a facade consultant or an enclosure consultant has always been something that has existed. I think we have a lot of very savvy, not saying other markets don't have savvy developers or building owners, but we have a lot of people that I think really value the input of an enclosure consultant. And now, so with the energy code changing, I actually think it's almost pushed even further, where before you're seeing architecture firms that may have done a lot of this in-house. Some of them are reaching out at these early stages to work with firms like ourselves who have maybe a little bit more experience doing the enclosure backstop, derating assemblies, that type of thing. I think that's kind of pushed it a little bit further now. I think the number of presentations Andrew and I have done over the past year talking about the energy code, I think one of the comments you always hear is like, well, it looks like I need an enclosure consultant on every one of my projects now. And so, we smile and we say, yeah, probably. But I think the market's always had a place. The interesting thing on like the enclosure commissioning side, Boston's one of those markets where you'll often have an enclosure consultant and a building enclosure commissioning agent on the same project. So you basically have two enclosure consultants on a project, a major project, whether that be higher ed or healthcare. It's pretty much a given that there's going to be there's going to be an enclosure consultant on both sides of the table.
Yeah, expanding what Luke just said. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, with the increased stringency and requirements per updated codes like our Massachusetts stretch code, it's creating a lot more opportunities for enclosure consultants to engage, because there's now some more specialized work required for code compliance and to be documented for code compliance. That there again, a lot of savvy design teams, a lot of savvy architects are here, and they can do a lot of that themselves. But there are these new documentation requirements, and having an enclosure consultant take a look at that can take some of that load off of the design team and help guide the design actually early on. Things like our building enclosure backstop, we actually really need to pay attention to areas and U values early on, and it can actually help shape conceptual level design work, kind of like we've seen in Passive House, that sort of iterative process where we kind of pay attention to performance, and that has impact on form factor, glazed area, U values, things like that. So some of the more stringent requirements have been prompting opportunities for us to maybe do a little more consulting. Luke said we have a lot of those lunch and learns. We conveniently leave our card at the end. So we have seen a big uptick with the implementation of new codes. So.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask. Unless if it's not a performance passive house project where there's true performance metrics that can be measured, and there's sort of implied risk if they go down this path and don't achieve it, or if you're trying to achieve some type of envelope backstop and you might be working with an uninformed architect when it comes to detailing and they need help. What is the value proposition in your eyes when it's not code driven? Meaning you're trying to go and sell your service to an owner as an envelope consultant. It's kind of hard to justify that you spend X dollars on us, you're going to save this. And it is really a soft sell. So other than, I mean, I guess I would focus on risk mitigation, on a condo job, avoiding leaks. But unless somebody's been burned, sort of, what's the elevator pitch, or like, how do you, go to somebody that hadn't had one before and explain the value?
If we're talking about Boston in general, or the greater Boston area, or communities that are governed by the stretch code, I think right now, the value proposition, I think, for a developer who's building something that is you're after maximizing rentable floor space, the conversation comes down to is with absolute metrics, which is what our code is based on. It's not a percent better than or equal to from a backstop perspective. You have a target that you need to meet. So there's some ability to optimize the design. And when you are able to use, choose window detailing or choose window systems in a thoughtful manner, that could be the difference between 2, sometimes 3 inches of exterior insulation, which means your wall assembly is getting thicker, you're encroaching on rentable floor space. So from an early phase perspective for us, I think that's the biggest value proposition that I think we can bring to the table, is saying like, hey, it may be foreign to you that we're here on this project, but there's the opportunity for us to, your wall assembly is going to be thicker than it was before. You're going to lose out on your rentable floor space. We can help work to try and optimize that and maximize that. But obviously there's other factors like the aesthetics of the building. We're engineers, or at least I'm an engineer. I'm less concerned about the aesthetics of it. I would, prefer it to be the best building possible. But I mean, you look at other markets like the Vancouver, BC market. Like the reason that Passive House took off there is they got a code exemption in there that allowed for expanding beyond your typical lot line setbacks for buildings that were pursuing passive house because they knew that the wall assembly, so people could optimize and gain more rentable square footage on a plot of land. And so that's, that was kind of the inflection point that for that market. So I think making that similar case here for developers, especially since we are seeing what's probably the beginnings of a housing or a multifamily construction boom here. I think that's the discussion point is maximizing rentable floor space.
That's interesting. I hadn't really. So that's a metric that you can go back to a developer and make the case, kind of look at a case study of before and after and justify even more square footage area, but less insulation or however you model it to justify reducing some hard costs. But what is the, like, where was I going to go with that?
Well, just to finish out on that one point that you had there, Adrian, I think it's the other thing is like when people hear passive house, they're like, oh, 6-8 inches of exterior insulation. I mean, for the most part, depending on the form factor of a building, 3 to 4 inches will probably get you there. Like, it's not actually, it's really about the details. It's about minimizing your thermal bridging. You could end up with 6 or 8 inches if you just stick your windows in the same old way you've always stuck your windows in a building. But, there's some optimization and a learning curve there that allows you to get to a point where, hey, the cost of construction actually isn't 10, 15%. It's 1, 2, maybe even 0.
Who's doing that modeling though?
The optimization process?
Yeah, the as built, if they're taking the performance route, not prescriptive, the as built or site condition of or detailed condition of how the envelope will perform.
So so it depends. So if it's a multifamily building, it is passive house under the stretch code essentially. So at that point, your passive house consultant, which is something that RDH does, is that modeling component would be something that we would do on a lot of projects. If it's a non-resident or if it's non-multifamily and non-passive house, that optimization tool is actually just a spreadsheet, right? Like you can go through and use a backstop calculator pretty readily and play with side install values of say window perimeters. And you can play with thicknesses of insulation. We'll often do like 15 iterations of a building at an early phase to try and figure out like how low can we go insulation wise and what does that do to the window install detail.
What about in a jurisdiction that's not passive house? Passive house requirement doesn't align with the code. I'm talking anywhere else. You would assume in these other areas, I don't know, let's say you go somewhere in Connecticut or Albany or even areas in New Jersey or just outside major markets, Washington, D.C., just following building code, do you find the majority of buildings just go the prescriptive route and not the performance?
I would say most of the time you end up starting out there, but then all of a sudden it's like, well, then I'm not sure if you've cracked a 2024 IECC yet, but that has limitations on your window to wall area that push you out of prescriptive paths as well. So I think a lot of buildings start out with that intent kind of basis of design, but as you add more glazing, then you quickly go into a need to do a model performance. And so most buildings are going to do model for LEED anyway.
I mean, I guess the question is, in that model, do you think there's low-hanging fruit that's being overlooked?
I think to be honest with you, yeah, I think there is. I think there's I actually think that doing derating, I think doing derating is actually a pretty simple and straightforward exercise that, but right now the current code iterations don't require it. So you just slap on your Clearfield R value, ignore the thermal bridges, and just build your building. I think depending on like the owner groups that make the most sense to kind of try to optimize their performance and reduce energy costs are those who are, long-term holders. So like your institutions, the people who are holding onto those buildings need to maintain them. Those are the ones that I think see the value in the enclosure. We don't do a lot of new condo buildings from the ground up. It's just not something we do in this market. We do, or we often see beforehand, and even some more so now, a lot of the projects we work on are higher ed and market rate apartments and some affordable work, but higher ed, healthcare, those types of projects where owners see the value of. Prior to this, it wasn't so much thermal perspective, it was water leaks, but it just so happens that RDH has been set up that we can do both. We can talk energy, we can talk thermal performance, and we can talk about you know, durability and water management as well.
So
Yeah,
even if the let's say not a institutional client, even these multifamily buildings that are going up, they still have to comply with code. So how does it what is sort of the chain of command in terms of who who's taking responsibility? You have an architect that's detailing, maybe you have an envelope consultant that's informing, but do you have a separate energy modeler, and what does that collaboration look like?
I'll respond to that. Regardless of your market and your code compliance pathway, all buildings benefit from a whole building approach to design. The things that impact performance, we know are your enclosure in combination with your mechanical systems. We know regardless if it's a passive house building or not, we can still take advantage of passive design principles. We can maximize the performance of a building enclosure to reduce the loads and demands in the building, and optimize between enclosure and mechanical. We can size mechanical smaller if we have a more efficient enclosure. Particularly in places where we're trying to electrify, you really want to reduce loads first before you switch over to minimize the impact on the grid. So a lot of these principles, can be applied across jurisdictions and markets, and we benefit from looking at buildings in a whole building performance lens. Um, Various jurisdictions also have their own decarbonization targets. These 2030, 2050 targets, we still see in many markets, regardless of where their code is currently. Um, and a lot of those codes are catching up. And there's also building standards programs where, like Berto in Boston, we're reporting emissions of the building and portfolios that owners have. So there are many programs like that across the country as well, where, if we're really focusing on decarbonization targets, like many jurisdictions and college campuses, everyone has a plan these days with their own targets. That whole building performance beyond prescriptive code minimums needs to be evaluated to get us there. And I guess to your point too, who's taking ownership of that? When we perform an integrated role of enclosure and energy, we can evaluate that. We have energy modelers with mechanical engineering backgrounds. We can help inform the discussion and kind of be the glue that binds the design team together, coordinating between mechanical engineer and architect and running the energy model and optimizing enclosure performance and seeing what we can do with mechanical based on that. So, it really benefits teams to have a consultant that can evaluate all these things in a whole building approach.
Do you think I would say it's atypical, but where's the sort of conflict of interest arise when you think about the collaboration between a mechanical consultant and a facade consultant, and then how they're bridged to the energy model? As you said, it's all about the loads. And so if you take an envelope first approach, then hopefully you could reduce the size of your mechanical systems and make the whole thing overall efficient. But a lot of times is there a lack of collaboration between the two entities?
I would say there's not a lack of collaboration. There's more collaboration now in Boston than there used to be. Like the inputs I mean, at the end of the day, the inputs for what makes it complicated is that the input that you ultimately put into the energy model for that are enclosure related are window U value, wall U value, and infiltration/exfiltration rate. Those are the three. But the opaque wall U value, or I guess roofs go in there as well. Sorry, but like your opaque wall U value, that used to be prescriptive. People just plug in the prescriptive value or plug in the code value for all, and run your energy model. Now it's like there's a whole spreadsheet, there's a whole quantity takeoff, all that stuff feeds into that, and so right now, I think that energy modeling scope used to land with a mechanical engineer on every project because they're doing the mechanical design, they're going to run the lead model. Like we do see some energy code, or we do see like some lead consultants doing energy modeling as well for lead performance or lead accreditation. But now it's kind of like it used to not really, it was kind of a non-starter. Like we would always say, hey, we could do energy modeling. And it was like, no, mechanical does this. That's what the mechanical does. But now there's this additional level of complexity for those inputs that running that iterative process, it's like closure consultant or facade consultant does all their iterations over here, then they send a number. And then they're like, well, that number didn't work. And then you go back and you do the same thing. So like there's kind of the complexity of the inputs and the amount of iterations that could go into a model have kind of swung over to the enclosure side. And so that's kind of where we see like that's where it makes sense for an enclosure consultant to hold that model, because they're going to be able to run that iterative process. And then, mechanical inputs tend to, for the most part, are going to stay the same. Or you could come back and say, hey, we reduce our load to this, mechanical engineer, what are your inputs?
No, I mean, it makes complete sense, but you run this kind of whole building energy model, and you can assume what are we ultimately measuring, what their utility bill is going to cost. I mean, maybe in a passive house application, we're talking about the whole building air tightness, but where is the then connection between what was modeled versus what was actually built? And then where's the accountability in terms of, do they then go back and track back and said, well, wait, we designed to this, now we're not achieving this?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, right? So there's certain markets where like P3 projects will actually have that type of the performance of the building, post occupancy will dictate, what the final contract payments end up being, right? So, there's some cases where like the construction entity will operate the building for like 5 years after the build and try to hit those energy model targets. That type of thing I don't think exists very much or very frequently. That happens in Canada quite a bit. But I think it's an interesting question, and I think we look at these projects right now and it would probably be a very interesting case study to say, okay, we've got all these energy models that we did in Boston for code compliance. Let's take all those design phase energy models and let's see what the EUI is, or the total annual energy use. And maybe it's from maybe you try to parse out heating and cooling, because at the end of the day, you can't really control plug loads inside of a building, and what the use ends up being. But being able to compare actual in operation for the building versus what the model said during construction, I think it would be an interesting exercise to understand, is that a 10% delta right now? Is that under the new code, is it closer? But there's models, they're never going to reflect real world accuracy, but you can use a modeling tool should be used to help inform decisions, in my opinion, not necessarily be like the decision driver.
Well, then what do you do in terms of, do you build in a factor of safety, like on these things that you can't predict, plug loads, how often people are going to be opening, closing their windows? It, where do you go from there?
Yeah, again, it's like I don't think we're there in terms of like at least I'm not aware of jurisdictions that like require that type of thing. I know Passive House does do some checks, but I think post occupancy monitoring is really cool. Like we've done a ton of work. Our Toronto office has done a ton of work, and like we have an energy modeling group up there that knows how much power a gaming computer uses versus a standard laptop that's plugged in regularly. Like they've kind of metered a bunch of these things, because they're like, oh, we got a student dormitory we're going to put online. We're going to assume X number of gaming computers go into this student dormitory. So, I mean, you can really get into the weeds, but the question is like, how accurate does it need to be?
I mean, additionally, there are construction, post-construction, quality assurance, checks that do occur in code, definitely here in Massachusetts, but beyond as well. I mean, those things that impact whole building performance. When we look at enclosure and we look at whole building air tightness, for instance, that's nothing new, having requirements for whole building air tightness in code. Seattle for 10 years has had requirements. They're currently requiring a 0.25 CFM per square foot at 75 pascals. That's been the case in over the course of a decade there, we finally have that requirement in Massachusetts across all buildings too. We have a different air tightness requirement across, but it's applied to all buildings. So we have that requirement for certain buildings under our passive house or Teddy paths. It's subject to requirements of that modeling. In the case of pass house, that's a fixed number. In a Teddy path, you're going to have an air tightness number that you've modeled to, and you're checking that. So, that in combination with construction phase enclosure reviews like those that we typically do anyway and have done before the code changes, we catch a lot of the things that may lead to deficiencies in enclosure performance beyond that might drive that performance gap between modeled and actual. So, there's things you can do in construction, just monitoring progress and making sure that things are being built as designed, and participating in the process with the contractor, with the CM, making sure that coordination is happening between all the subs that are touching air barriers. There's a number of things that we do, and codes are requiring and have required around the country that help contribute towards that quality assurance for ensuring that the enclosure functions as intended. On the mechanical side too, I mean, there's mechanical commissioning to ensure that those things are functioning that way too. We do see a real benefit with post-construction monitoring, in that first year, making sure that the ongoing operation of things like mechanical is in fact happening, making sure that some damper's not closed, making sure that the range hood in the commercial kitchen isn't on full blast the whole year. So things like that, you do benefit from post-construction monitoring to catch those things that can then be compared back to the energy model saying, hey, that's way out of whack, right? So there are a number of things that we have done, are doing, code requires that can contribute towards the success of ensuring actual performance that is in line with modeled.
Do you think when you have something like Berto or even local on 97, where maybe a building owner might be fined if their EUI exceeds a certain threshold value based on the size of the building and the building use type, now you're going to have sort of that much more scrutiny on the upfront end because you have this sort of bridge between pre-construction, post-construction, and what's going to get their attention more than my building's going to be fined. So all of a sudden, there's a little bit of accountability on everyone's end.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about where we are in this period in history, right, is like 2050 is in our lifetime, but not only in our lifetime, it's within the typical service life of a lot of building components we put on a building from day one. So I think there is a duty from the design professionals to do a check to make sure that, like, the other day Andrew and I were talking about this, and we put together a Berto calculator that basically you put in your modeled annual energy use versus the square footage, and you choose your assembly type, or you choose your building type or your use type, and then it plots based on the emissions factors from Berto, and it plots the Berto targets to see where your building that you're going to put into service or potentially build, where that eventually crosses the Berto threshold. The ideal place that it crosses the Berto threshold in Boston is 2049. If it crosses before that, you should probably think about making some changes, because we don't want to turn over a building to an owner that in 10 years time, you're going to say, hey, you're going to need to do an energy improvement project to meet this thing that we knew was coming. And sorry, we didn't do that.
And for reference, 2050 is in
Zero.
Our Berto building. It's our timeline for net zero. So that's what we're talking about. And in programs like Berto and Local Law 97, we have stepped targets between now and 2050, right? And so when Luke is saying 2050 is, only 26 years away, right? So we have components of our buildings that we're designing now that will still be in service then, net zero performance then. So we encourage clients to consider the long-term operation of their buildings towards that 2050 goal, with those stepped emissions requirements tightening. And yes, a fine could be a good motivation to comply with those emissions targets.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I think what I'll ask the two of you is what's the best way for people to get in touch if they either want to engage one of you early on or are interested in now see the value in bringing on an envelope specialist.
Yeah, we have our Boston, our BOS at RDH.com is probably the easiest way to get a hold of us. Or you just call the office. Yeah, we take on buildings of all shapes and sizes. And the one thing that's I would say that is really refreshing about the energy code here in Boston has been something that's is difficult, to say the least. But the city of Boston has a ton of very intelligent design professionals, and our construction community are top notch in my opinion. And so we're figuring it out, and yeah, I think the greatest thing about it is like there's been a lot of complacency that has been in practice for our industry in terms of like this is how we build a building, this is what we do, and now we're met with new challenges, and we're actually getting to kind of stretch our creativity a little bit more. So that part is by far the most fun for me, even though sometimes it's very painful too.
For sure. All right, Luke and Andrew, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it, Adrian.
Adrian.
Talk to you guys soon.